A rancher found a dying Mustang at his barn, but what the note said left him in total shock. In the dead of winter, when the wind howls through the mountains, he stumbles on a half-starved horse collapsed in the straw. Tied in its mane is a torn scrap of paper, words scrawled by a desperate hand. "Find my daughter, or she will die." But that note is only the beginning, because hidden inside is a secret so powerful it could strip the rancher of everything he owns. A child, shivering in the snow. A deed no one wants to believe, and a town ready to turn against them both. The church bell tolls hooves, thunder on the frozen ground. Jail keys rattle. Justice hangs by a thread. What happens when mercy demands more than a man thinks he can give? And will he risk his life and his land for a daughter who isn't his own? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for Mortal Stroud's boots crunched through the frozen snow as he made his way across the barnyard, the pre-dawn darkness pressing in around his flickering lantern. His breath clouded in the bitter air while his mind churned over the day's work ahead, mending fences, checking on the pregnant heifers, breaking ice on the stock tank. Same as every winter morning these past 3 years since Sarah passed. The creak of his leather gloves gripping. The lantern handle was the only sound besides the wind whining through the prairie grass. Until it wasn't. A sudden thrashing noise erupted from inside the barn, followed by the panicked wheeze of a horse in distress. Dale quickened his pace, boots slipping slightly on the packed snow. He yanked open the heavy barn door, raising his lantern high. The yellow light swept across the familiar shapes of his own horses, their heads raised in alarm. Steam rising from their nostrils. In the last stall, a dark shape thrashed against the straw. Dale moved closer, his heart pounding. A Mustang lay there, its coat slick with sweat despite the cold, sides heaving with each labored breath. Blood matted the horse's flanks, though Dale couldn't spot any obvious wounds in the dim light. "Easy?" "There," he murmured, setting the lantern on a nearby post. The Mustang's wild eyes rolled toward him, showing whites. Dale approached slowly, one hand extended. "Ain't gonna hurt you none." The horse was clearly exhausted, making no attempt to rise as Dale knelt beside it. Its mane was tangled, something fierce, and as Dale ran his hands through the coarse hair to check for injuries, his fingers caught on something that wasn't horsehair at all. Frowning, he carefully worked at the knot until a folded piece of paper came free. It was damp with sweat and barely holding together. Dale moved closer to the lantern, unfolding the note with careful fingers. The writing was shaky, as if penned in great haste or distress. "This horse carried my daughter, find her, or she will die. She is hidden in the arroyo." Dale read the words twice more, his throat tightening. The paper trembled slightly in his weathered hands. A child out there somewhere in this killing cold. He glanced at the Mustang, noting how its sides still heaved. With exhaustion, this horse had run hard and far to reach his barn. "Reckon you done your part," he told the animal softly. He retrieved a handful of oats from the feed bin and held them out. The Mustang's velvet lips twitched, then carefully lifted the oats from his palm. Dale stood, his joints protesting the cold. The sensible thing would be to ride into town, alert the sheriff. But town was 15 miles away, and if there really was a girl out there, he shook his head, trying to dismiss the whole thing as some kind of prank or mistake. What kind of parent would hide their child in an arroyo? Yet he couldn't shake the desperation he sensed in those hastily scrawled words. The Mustang's head drooped. Strength finally spent. Dale tucked the blanket more securely around it, then strode to where his own horse, Buck, dozed in his stall. "Sorry, old friend," Dale muttered as he began saddling the sturdy bay gelding. "Gonna need you earlier than usual today." Buck's ears flicked back and forth as Dale tightened the cinch, clearly picking up on his rider's tension. Dale worked quickly but thoroughly, checking each strap twice. The temperature would only drop further as dawn approached, and he'd need every bit of daylight to search the maze-like arroyos that cut through his land. He filled his saddlebags with basic supplies. Rope, bandages from the medical kit Sarah had always insisted on keeping stocked, a few strips of dried beef, matches. Wrapped in oilcloth. After a moment's thought, he added an extra blanket. If there really was a child out there, the eastern sky was just beginning to lighten as Dale led Buck out of the barn. He swung into the saddle, settling into the familiar creak of leather. The gelding shifted beneath him, eager to move in the tree. Move into cold. Dale looked back at the barn where the mysterious Mustang lay. Part of him still wanted to dismiss the note as nonsense, to return to his normal routine and let whatever strange drama this was pass him by. He'd learned the hard way that getting involved in other folks' troubles rarely ended well, but he couldn't forget Sarah's voice, clear as if she still sat beside him at the supper table. The good Lord don't give us easy choices, Dale. He gives us right ones. Dale touched the brim of his hat in habitual gesture, then turned Buck toward the rising sun. The first fingers of dawn reached across the snow-covered prairie as horse and riders set out, following the Mustang's tracks back the way they'd come. Lord willing, Dale murmured into the gray morning, we'll find her in time. The hoofprints led east toward the network of arroyos that cut deep gashes through his grazing land. In summer, flash floods could turn those dry gullies into death traps. In winter, the deep shadows held ice and snow long after the prairie above had thawed. Buck picked his way carefully along the trail, his hooves breaking through the frozen crust of snow. Dale kept his eyes on the ground, reading the story read in. There, the Mustang's tracks were erratic, showing where the exhausted horse had stumbled and weaved. Here and there, drops of blood stained the white surface. The sun finally crested the horizon as they reached the first arroyo. Dale reined Buck to a stop at the edge, studying the steep walls of the ravine. The Mustang's tracks disappeared over the rim. Looking down into the shadows below, Dale felt the weight of what he was undertaking settle more heavily on his shoulders, finding one small girl in this maze of gullies and draws would be like searching for a needle in a haystack. And with each passing minute, the cold grew more deadly. Still, he had to try. Dale nudged Buck forward, picking a careful path down into the arroyo. The gelding's hooves slipped slightly on the icy slope, but he kept his footing. At the bottom, Dale paused again, studying the ground. The Mustang's tracks were clearer here, protected from the wind that scoured the prairie above. Just gotta follow the signs, Dale told himself, his voice sounding hollow in the stillness of the ravine. Lord, help us both. He turned Buck downstream, following the meandering course of the dry creek bed. The walls of the arroyo threw long shadows across their path, and Dale's hands were growing numb despite his thick gloves. If a child had spent the night out here, he pushed the thought aside. Worrying wouldn't help. Action would. Dale settled deeper in his saddle, eyes scanning the ground ahead as Buck carried him further into the maze of canyons, searching for any sign of the mysterious girl whose life might depend on him finding her in time. The winter sun cast long shadows across the snow as Dale guided Buck deeper into the maze of arroyos. The gelding's hooves crunched through ice-crusted drifts, following the meandering trail of the exhausted Mustang. Every few yards, Dale had to dismount to check the tracks were still visible, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. Fainter, he muttered, squinting at the ground. The wind had done its work, slowly erasing the signs he followed. But here and there, dark spots of blood still marked the Mustang's passing, leading him onward like breadcrumbs. The arroyo walls rose higher as he pressed on, their red-brown faces striped with ice where water had seeped and frozen. Buck's ears swiveled constantly, alert for mountain lions that might den in the shadowy crevices. Dale kept one hand near his rifle, though his thoughts were more focused on finding any sign of the child. After what felt like hours of careful tracking, Buck suddenly lifted his head, nostrils flaring. Dale tensed, following the horse's gaze toward a narrow side canyon. Something dark huddled against the base of the cliff, barely visible in the shadows. "Whoa there," Dale murmured, reining Buck to a stop. He dismounted slowly, his joints stiff with cold. The shape didn't move as he approached, and his heart sank. But then he caught a tiny movement, the flutter of fabric in the wind. Dale hurried, forward boots slipping on the icy ground. As he drew closer, the bundle resolved itself into a small figure wrapped in a ragged blanket. An Apache girl, he realized with a jolt of surprise. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old, her dark hair tangled with ice crystals. "Hey there," he said softly, kneeling beside her. Her eyes were closed, but her lips moved slightly, forming words he could barely hear. Dale leaned closer. "The Lord is my shepherd." The words came out broken, half English and half something else, barely a whisper. "I shall not want." Dale's chest tightened. He touched her cheek gently. Her skin was cold as stone, but she was alive, and that was what mattered. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her thin frame. "Hold on now," he told her, though he wasn't sure she could hear. "We're getting you somewhere warm." She weighed almost nothing as he lifted her. Buck stood steady as Dale mounted awkwardly, cradling the girl against his chest. He turned the horse's head toward home, urging him to pick up the pace while still being careful of the treacherous footing. The ride back seemed twice as long, with Dale constantly checking the bundle in his arms. The girl's breathing remained shallow but steady, and occasionally her lips would move again, forming fragments of scripture he recognized from his own Bible reading by the time they reached his cabin. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks. Dale's arms ached as he carried the girl inside, but he moved quickly, laying her near the potbelly stove. He built up the fire until the iron sides glowed cherry red, then wrapped her in every blanket he could find. "What kind of mess you gotten yourself into now, Stroud?" he muttered as he moved around the cabin, gathering supplies. "Should have just rode for the sheriff. Gonna be nothing but trouble, mark my words." But even as he grumbled, his hands stayed, busy stoking the fire, heating water, measuring out beef stock and dried vegetables for broth. Sarah had always kept the cabin well stocked with medical supplies and basic necessities, habits he'd maintained more out of respect for her memory than any real conviction. The girl stirred slightly as warmth began returning to her limbs. Dale watched her face for any sign of pain or distress, but she seemed peaceful enough, her breathing growing stronger. Still, he knew the danger wasn't past. He'd seen men lose fingers and toes to frostbite even after getting warm. As he waited for the broth to simmer, Dale pulled out the crumpled note that had started all this. Something about its thickness caught his attention, and he carefully unfolded it further. There was indeed a second leaf of paper, stuck to the first by sweat and frost. "Well now," he said softly, starting to separate them, but then he stopped. Himself glancing at the girl, she needed tending first. Whatever secret the note held could wait until morning. Dale retrieved his old Bible from its shelf and tucked the papers carefully between its pages. The worn leather volume had been Sarah's wedding gift to him, though he'd read it more in the lonely years since her passing than he ever had when she was alive. The cabin grew dark as evening settled in. But Dale didn't light the lamp. The stove cast enough glow to see by, and he didn't want to waste kerosene. He spooned small amounts of broth between the girl's lips whenever she seemed conscious enough to swallow, watching with growing concern as night fully claimed the valley. Wind whistled through the cabin's chinked logs, rattling the shutters he'd closed against the cold. The sound made the place feel even more isolated than usual, reminding Dale just how far they were from town and help. If things went wrong, he settled into his chair, rifle across his knees more from habit than any real expectation of trouble. The girl's breathing had grown deeper and more regular, but he wasn't about to sleep until he was sure she'd made it through the worst. "Lord," he whispered into the quiet cabin, "I sure hope I done right by bringing her here." Even as he said it, he knew he couldn't have done anything else. Whatever complications tomorrow might bring, at least he'd followed his conscience today. The wind moaned around the eaves, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. Dale pulled his coat tighter around his shoulders, preparing for a long night of watching and waiting. The girl murmured something in her sleep, another fragment of scripture. He thought, though he couldn't make out the words. He found himself wondering what story lay behind her presence in his arroyo, and what the hidden note might reveal. But those were questions for tomorrow. For now, all that mattered was keeping her warm and seeing her through till morning. The first rays of sunlight crept through the cabin's frost-edged windows, casting pale squares on the plank floor. Dale stirred from his chair, his neck stiff from the long night's vigil. He dozed off and on, waking at every small sound, the pop of the stove's cooling iron, the whisper of wind in the eaves. The girl's quiet breathing. He stood slowly, stretching, muscles cramped from the cold. The fire had burned low during the night, and he added fresh logs before checking on his unexpected guest. Her color looked better in the dawn light, a hint of warmth returning to her cheeks. The worst danger seemed past. As he adjusted the blanket around her shoulders, her eyes fluttered open. Dark eyes, clear and intelligent despite her exhaustion, fixed on his face. "Mariel," she whispered, the word barely audible. Then her eyes closed again, and she drifted back to sleep. Mariel, Dale repeated softly, testing the name. It fit her, somehow delicate yet resilient, like the wild roses that bloomed in hidden valley corners each spring. The Bible sat where he'd left it, on the table, the mysterious paper still tucked between its pages. Dale glanced at the sleeping girl, then pulled out his chair and reached for the book. Whatever the note contained, it was time to know. His fingers trembled slightly as he separated the papers. The second sheet was older than the first, its creases worn soft with handling. Official-looking writing filled the page. The ink faded, but still clear enough to read. Dale's eyes widened as he took in the formal language, the official seals. The paper slipped from his suddenly numb fingers, nearly falling before he caught it. A deed. Not just any deed, but one transferring legal ownership of his ranch land, his home, his livelihood, to a woman named Sarah White-Adair, under terms of the Medicine Lodge Treaty of 1867. "Can't be," he muttered, pushing back from the table. But the words didn't change as he read them again. The boundaries matched his property exactly. The creek to the north, the ridge to the west, the old lightning-struck pine marking the southern corner. Dale began to pace, his boots striking the floor with sharp thuds. 5 steps to the door, turn, 5 steps back. The cabin felt too small, the walls pressing in around him. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. He'd bought this land fair and square from old Jim Webster 7 years ago, hadn't he? But the deed's date went back further, 11 years, to when the treaty was signed. And there at the bottom was an official signature and seal he recognized from other government documents. "Lord Almighty," he breathed, running a hand through his hair. Everything he'd worked for, everything he'd built here, none of it was truly his, had never been his to buy. The girl Mariel shifted in her sleep, drawing his attention. Sarah White-Adair must have been her mother. The woman who'd written that desperate note, who'd trusted her only child to a wild Mustang speed and a stranger's mercy. Speaking of the Mustang, Dale needed air. needed to think. He pulled on his coat and stepped out into the crisp morning. The sun had risen fully now, painting the snow-covered peaks with rose and gold. Beautiful country. Country, or so he'd always thought. The barn door creaked as he pushed it open. Inside, the Mustang lifted its head from a pile of fresh hay, watching him warily. The horse's wounds weren't as bad as they'd first appeared. Mostly scrapes and bruises from a hard run through rough country. Already its eyes looked brighter, more alert. "Tough one, ain't you?" Dale said softly, approaching with careful steps. The Mustang's ears flicked forward at his voice, but it didn't shy away. He ran a gentle hand down its neck, feeling the strong muscles beneath the rough coat. "Just like your little rider in there. Both of you survivors." The horse's strength and resilience touched something in Dale's heart. Here was a wild creature that had given everything to save a child, running until it could run no more. And now it was healing, drawing on deep reserves of vitality to recover. He spent an hour in the barn, checking his other stock while keeping an eye on the Mustang. The familiar routine of feeding and watering helped settle his troubled thoughts, though the deed's revelations still weighed heavy on his mind. When he returned to the cabin, the sun had climbed past noon. Marielle was awake, propped against the pillows he'd given her. Her eyes followed him as he moved around the small space, gathering what he needed to make more broth. "Thank you," she said softly as he handed her a cup. Her English was careful but clear, each word precisely chosen. "Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name." The familiar prayer caught Dale by surprise. He hadn't heard those words since Sarah's funeral, hadn't wanted to hear them. But something in the girl's quiet voice, her simple faith, even after all she'd been through, touched that empty place in his heart where prayer used to live. Without quite meaning to, he found himself bowing his head. The words didn't come, not yet, but the gesture itself felt like breaking ground that had lain fallow too long. Marielle finished her prayer and sipped the broth slowly. Dale busied himself with small tasks, not wanting to overwhelm her with questions. There would be time enough for those later. When she was stronger, as evening approached, he lit the lamp and settled at the table. The deed lay before him, its official text swimming in the yellow light. His life had turned upside down in the space of a day. Everything he thought he knew about his place here, his rights to this land, had been pulled out from under him like a rug. The lamp's flame wavered, making shadows dance on the cabin walls. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the windows. Dale stared at the deed, reading and rereading its words as if hoping they might somehow change. But the truth remained as stark as the official seal at the bottom of Q. Dale, the page this land had never truly been his to claim. Dawn painted the eastern sky in watercolor. Stripes of pink and gold as Dale checked the knots on his saddlebags. The morning air bit sharp and clean, his breath forming clouds in the frigid stillness. He'd put off the ride to town as long as he dared, but Marielle's fever hadn't broken. She needed proper medicine, not just his rough home remedies. Inside the cabin, he found her exactly where he'd left her, curled beneath a nest of quilts near the pot-bellied stove. Her dark eyes tracked his movement as he added another log to the fire. "I'm heading to town," he said, keeping his voice gentle. "Got plenty of wood stacked right here. Fire should hold till I get back." He hesitated, then added, "You'll be safe." Mariel nodded, pulling the blankets closer. Dale felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same one he'd felt watching Sarah waste away 3 winters ago. His wife's final days had been full of fevered prayers, not for herself, but for him. "Lord," she'd whispered, "soften his heart before it turns to stone." The memory followed him out to the barn where his bay gelding waited, already saddled. The morning had warmed enough to start melting the snow, making the trail to town treacherous with hidden ice. Dale kept the horse to a careful walk, using the time to sort through his troubled thoughts. Sarah would have known what to do about Mariel. She'd always had a way with strays, hurt animals, lost travelers. Even that missionary family whose wagon had broken down one spring. But Sarah was gone, and Dale had spent 3 years building walls around his grief. Now, this girl and her mother's deed threatened to breach every one of them. The sun had climbed past morning when Dale finally rode into town. Miller's Creek wasn't much a church, a mercantile. A few dozen buildings strung along the rutted main street, but it served the scattered ranches and homesteads well enough. Usually, Dale appreciated its familiar rhythms. Today, though, something felt off. He tied his horse outside the mercantile and had just reached for the door when voices drifted from the alley. Men's voices pitched low but clear in the winter air. A patchy girl in Stroud's cabin. "You sure about that, Jim? Saw her myself when I rode past yesterday." All bundled up by his stove like she belongs there. Means trouble. Mark my words. Man ought to know better. Dale's hand tightened on the door handle. News traveled fast in small towns, but this was quicker than he'd expected. He pushed inside, telling himself it didn't matter what they thought. The mercantile's warmth wrapped around him, carrying the familiar mixed scents of coffee, leather, and tobacco. Old Mrs. Peterson stood behind the counter, her iron-gray hair pulled back severe as always. But before Dale could reach her, another figure stepped into his path. "Morning, Stroud," said Mr. Kavanaugh, the town banker. He was a tall man, with sharp features and clothes too fine for frontier living. "Might have a word." Dale nodded stiffly. He'd never much liked Kavanaugh, who seemed to take pleasure in foreclosing on struggling homesteaders. The banker moved closer, lowering his voice, though they were alone in that corner of the store. "Been thinking about your spread," Kavanaugh said. "Good water rights, prime grazing. Railroads coming through next year, you know. Might be interested in making you an offer." "Not selling," Dale said flatly. Kavanaugh's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Everything's for sale at the right price, Stroud, especially with times being what they are. Man alone on a big spread like that, bound to get overwhelming eventually." The words carried a weight Dale didn't like. He stepped around the banker without answering, heading straight for Mrs. Peterson. She had the medicines he needed, wrapped and ready before he could ask. Word really had gotten around. "Willow bark tea helps with fever too," she offered quietly, as she handed him the package. "My grandmother's remedy." "Much obliged," Dale said, paying quickly. He could feel Kavanaugh's eyes on his back as he left the store. The ride home seemed longer, though the trail had dried somewhat. Dale found himself watching the tree line, checking for signs anyone had passed near his property. The gossip in town had left him uneasy, and Kavanaugh's interest in his land sat wrong in his gut. Relief washed through him when he finally topped the last rise and saw smoke rising steady from his chimney. Inside, he found Mariel exactly where he'd left her, though she'd managed to add wood to the fire on her own. "Brought medicine," he said, setting down his packages. "But we'll try Mrs. Peterson's remedy first. Might go easier on you." Dale busied himself preparing the willow bark tea, measuring carefully and letting it steep the way Sarah had taught him. When it was ready, he helped Mariel sit up to sip it slowly. "Thank you," she whispered. Then, so quiet he almost missed it, "Does God still listen when everything is lost?" The question caught Dale off guard, echoing too closely his own thoughts after Sarah died. He stared into the fire, watching flames dance across the logs. Part of him wanted to brush off the question or give her some easy answer. But something in her voice, in the way she clutched the tin cup like it was all she had left in the world, demanded honesty. "I've asked that same thing," he admitted finally. "Don't rightly know the answer." Mariel nodded, as if she'd expected this. She took another sip of tea, her face thoughtful beyond her years. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Dale added another log, using the familiar motion to hide his discomfort. Kavanaugh's words kept coming back to him. Everything's for sale at the right price. The banker hadn't known about the deed, couldn't have known. But his sudden interest, combined with the townspeople's whispers, left Dale deeply unsettled. He settled into his chair, watching the flames dance as darkness gathered outside. The girl's question hung in the air between them, unanswered but not forgotten. Like so many things lately, it demanded attention he wasn't sure he was ready to give. The morning sun streamed through frost-edged windows as Dale watched Mariel take tentative steps across the cabin floor. Her fever had finally broken during the night, leaving her weak but determined. She gripped the back of a chair, her small fingers white with effort. "Take it slow," Dale said, hovering nearby. "No need to rush." Mariel nodded, carefully making her way to the rough-hewn table. Dale had to admit she showed more grit than most grown men he knew. When she reached the table, she sank into a chair, breathing hard but smiling faintly. "Could I?" she hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Could I help? With anything?" Dale considered her request while stoking the stove. The girl needed rest, but he recognized the look in her eyes, the same one he'd worn after Sarah died, when idle hands left too. Much room for grief. "Reckon you could help with lunch," he said finally, "if you're up to it." He brought over carrots and potatoes from the root cellar, along with a small knife. Setting them on the table, he demonstrated how to cut them into even pieces for stew. "Like this," he showed her, making careful cuts. "Mind your fingers now." Mariel copied his movements exactly, her face drawn in concentration. Her hands trembled slightly, but each cut was precise. They worked in comfortable silence, broken only by the quiet thunk of knife against wood. "My mother," Mariel said softly. Not looking up from her work, she taught me to make stew, but with different plants, desert plants. Dale nodded, not pressing for more. He'd noticed how she mentioned her mother, always in past tense, always with a catch in her voice. It reminded him too much of his own careful way of speaking about Sarah. After lunch, Dale bundled Mariel in his spare coat and led her to the barn. The Mustang that had carried her message nickered softly at their approach. Dale showed her where he kept the brushes, demonstrating the long, smooth strokes that kept a horse's coat healthy. "Start gentle," he instructed. "Let them know. Your touch." Mariel reached out slowly, running her hand along the Mustang's neck before starting to brush. The horse lowered its head, relaxing under her care. Dale watched as she worked, noting how she whispered to the animal in her own language. "What are you telling him?" he asked. "Old songs," she replied. "About horses being brothers to the people. About wind and open places." Dale nodded, something tight loosening in his chest as he watched them. The Mustang's trust in Mariel spoke volumes. Horses knew good hearts when they met them. Back in the cabin that afternoon, Dale found Mariel studying Sarah's Bible. It lay open on the table, its pages worn soft with use. He'd seen her eyeing it for days, but hadn't known how to offer it. "Would you?" Mariel looked up at him. "Would you help me with the words? Some are different from what Mother taught." Dale pulled up a chair beside her. Sarah's familiar marginal notes brought a lump to his throat, her neat script marking favorite verses, questions, prayers. He hadn't opened the Bible since her passing, but Mariel's finger traced the lines with such reverence that he found himself reading aloud. "In my Father's house are many mansions," he read slowly, letting Mariel follow along. Her lips moved silently with the words. As the afternoon light softened toward evening, Dale heard horses approaching. He moved to the window, watching 3. Riders passed slowly by his fence line. They made no move to stop or call out, just studied his cabin with hard eyes before moving on. The smoke from his chimney curled up against the darkening sky, marking clear sign of life within. Best stay inside for now, he told Marielle, though she hadn't asked to go out. She nodded, already seeming to understand. Later that night, after supper was cleared away, Dale sat in his chair by the fire. The deed lay heavy in his shirt pocket, where he'd taken to carrying it. Each night he'd pull it out, study the careful script that declared this land his land, rightfully belonged to Marielle's mother under treaty promise. Each night he considered telling Marielle, then tucked it away again. "What paper do you read?" Marielle asked, suddenly from her place near the stove. "Every night you look at it? Is it from the Bible?" Dale's hand moved automatically to his pocket. "No," he said roughly. Just some ranch business." The lie tasted bitter. He watched Marielle nod acceptance, trusting him without question. The deed seemed to burn against his chest. To cover his discomfort, Dale busied himself banking the fire for the night. Marielle began to sing softly, a hymn he recognized, though the words were in her language. The melody of Amazing Grace filled the cabin, her clear voice carrying all the longing and hope the song held. Dale settled back in his chair, letting his eyes close. The familiar tune wrapped around him like a well-worn blanket. For the first time in 3 years, peace stole over him, unexpected and gentle as spring rain. Marielle's voice wove through the lamplight, blending English and Apache words in a prayer. Older than any deed or border. Dale kept his eyes closed, listening as she sang about grace that taught the heart to fear, and grace that fears relieved. In that moment, the cabin felt less empty than it had since Sarah died. The lamp flickered, low, casting soft shadows on the walls. Outside, an owl called into the gathering night. But inside, Marielle's hymn filled every corner with something that felt remarkably like hope. The storm rolled in just before dawn, bringing walls of white that erased the distant mountains. Dale woke to the moan of wind and the sharp tick of ice against glass. The temperature had dropped hard overnight, turning the world beyond his windows into a churning sea of snow. He found Marielle already awake, huddled close to the stove with Sarah's Bible open in her lap. She glanced up as he added wood to the fire, her dark eyes reflecting the flames. "Bad storm coming," Dale said, moving to check their supplies. He'd learned long ago to keep the pantry stocked through winter. Might be stuck inside a few days. Marielle nodded, returning to her reading. Her finger traced slowly across the page, lips moving silently with each word. Dale watched her for a moment, reminded of Sarah's patient way with difficult passages. The morning passed in quiet industry. Dale spread his tack repair supplies across the table, worn leather pieces that needed stitching, brass buckles gone, dull with use. His fingers worked methodically, the familiar task soothing in its simplicity. "Would you?" Marielle's voice was hesitant. "Would you like me to read?" Dale looked up from his work. She held the Bible carefully, almost reverently. "If you've a mind to," he said. Marielle began slowly, her English careful but clear. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." She stumbled over some words, pausing to sound them out. Dale found himself nodding encouragement when she glanced his way. "He maketh me to lie down in green pastures," she continued. The wind howled outside, but her voice stayed steady. "He leadeth me beside the still waters." As she read, Dale's hands moved automatically over the leather, pulling thread tight, working oil into dry spots. The familiar words filled the cabin, bringing warmth no fire could match. My mother, Marielle, paused in her reading, fingers tracing the page's edge. She taught me these words, in English and Apache, both. Dale set down his work, sensing a story coming. Marielle's eyes stayed fixed on the Bible, but her mind seemed far away. "She had this Mustang, the one that brought me here." Mariel's voice grew softer. "One night, soldiers came to our camp. Mother took only 3 things: me, this Bible, and the paper she always carried." The deed, Dale thought, his chest tightening. The paper that now burned in his pocket, challenging everything he'd built here. "We rode all night," Mariel continued. "The Mustang never stumbled, even in the dark. Mother said God guided his feet." She looked up finally, meeting Dale's eyes. She was right. "He brought me to you." Dale swallowed hard, unable to speak. How could he tell her that the land she had claimed to was all he had left? Yet looking at her, this child who'd lost everything but still held to faith, he knew he couldn't bear to see her turned out. The storm raged for 2 more days. They fell into an easy rhythm, Dale working on repairs while Mariel read or helped with small tasks. She showed surprising skill with needle and thread, mending a torn shirt with tiny nitty-even stitches. On the 3rd morning, Dale woke to silence. The wind had died, leaving the world draped in pristine white. Sunlight sparkled off drifts that reached halfway up his fence posts. "Want to help feed the horses?" He asked Mariel over breakfast. Her eyes lit up. "Yes, please." Dale bundled her in his spare coat again, wrapping an old scarf around her neck. They waded through knee-deep snow to the barn, where the horses greeted them with eager nickers. Like this, Dale demonstrated, showing her how to pull hay from the stack and spread it evenly. Make sure they all get their share. Mariel copied his movements exactly, just as she had with the vegetables days before. The Mustang stretched his neck over the stall door, nibbling hay from her hands. A smile broke across her face the first. Real smile Dale had seen since finding her in the arroyo. Something warm bloomed in his chest at the sight. It had been so long since laughter echoed in his barn, since anyone but him had shared these simple morning tasks. The feeling reminded him of springs long past, when Sarah's smile had been his daily blessing. They worked steadily, feeding and watering each animal. Mariel hummed as she moved between stalls, a melody that seemed to speak of summer grass and open skies. The horses listened, ears pricked forward, as if they understood. "You've got away with them," Dale said, watching her stroke the Mustang's nose. "They are like people," Mariel replied. "They know when you speak truth to them. Truth." The word hit Dale like a physical blow. The deed weighed heavy in his pocket. Demanding truth he wasn't ready to give. They finished the chores and stepped out into the dazzling morning. The snow had transformed everything, smoothing rough edges, hiding familiar landmarks under white curves and shadows. Dale showed Mariel how to break through ice in the water trough, explaining how vital it was to keep it clear for the stock. A movement caught his eye, a lone rider on the ridge above his property. The figure sat motionless against the bright sky, watching. Even at this distance, Dale could feel the weight of that observation. Mariel hadn't noticed, absorbed in her task with the ice. Dale kept his voice casual, not wanting to frighten her. Time to head in, getting near lunch. But as they walked back to the cabin, he saw the rider turn away, disappearing toward town. Something cold that had nothing to do with snow settled in Dale's stomach. He'd been foolish to think they could stay hidden forever. Inside, Mariel returned to her reading, voice growing more confident with each passage. Dale tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept returning to that silhouette on the ridge. Change was coming as surely as spring would follow winter. He only prayed he'd have the strength to meet it with the same faith. Mariel showed each time she opened Sarah's Bible. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, painting stripes across the cabin floor. Mariel's voice rose and fell with the ancient words of comfort. While outside, their tracks in the snow marked 2 paths moving as one between house and barn. For now at least, they had found shelter in each other's company, a fragile peace. Soon to be tested by forces beyond the storm, the morning air bit sharp, and clear as Dale hitched the wagon. Their supplies had dwindled enough to force a trip to town, though he'd put it off as long as he could. Marielle stood quietly by the barn door, wrapped in Sarah's old shawl, watching him work. "You don't have to come," Dale said, adjusting the harness. "Could stay here with the horses." Marielle shook her head. "I am not afraid," she said softly. Though her fingers twisted in the shawl's fringe, Dale helped her up onto the wagon seat. Noting how small she looked against the winter sky, the past weeks had put some color in her cheeks, but she was still too thin. They needed proper supplies, food, warmer clothes, maybe some books to help with her reading. The wagon wheels creaked over frozen ruts as they made their way down the mountain road. Mariel sat straight-backed beside him, taking in everything with watchful eyes. When the town's first buildings came into view, Dale felt her tense. "Remember," he said quietly, "you've as much right to be here as anyone." Main Street was busy with morning traffic, ranch hands loading supplies, women hurrying between shops, children racing past on their way to school. The wagon's approach drew immediate attention. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, heads turned, fingers pointed. Dale guided the horses to the hitching post outside the mercantile. The whispers started before he'd set the brake. "Apache girl, Stroud's. Gone soft, ought to be ashamed." Dale helped Mariel down, keeping his movements deliberate and calm, though his jaw clenched tight. She held her head high, but he felt her trembling through the thick shawl. Mr. Kavanaugh stepped out of the bank across the street, his well-polished boots clicking on the wooden walkway. Other townspeople gathered behind him like storm clouds. "Well, now, Stroud," Kavanaugh called out, his voice carrying clear down the street. "This is a surprise. Didn't expect to see you consorting with savages in broad daylight." Dale stepped between Mariel and Kavanaugh's cold stare. "We've come for supplies," he said evenly. "Nothing more. Supplies." Kavanaugh's laugh held no humor. "That what you call it? It's feeding and clothing one of them." He took another step forward. "You're betraying your own kind, Stroud. Everything we built here, everything your wife believed in." Dale's hands curled into fists at the mention of Sarah. He felt Mariel press closer to his back, silent but steady. "My wife," Dale said, his voice low and dangerous, "believed in mercy and justice." He put his arm around Mariel's shoulders, guiding her toward the mercantile. "Now if you'll excuse us." The store bell jangled as they entered. Mrs. Potter, the owner's wife, nearly dropped her dusting cloth at the sight of them. But Dale moved purposefully through the aisles, filling their list while Mariel stayed close beside him. They were examining fabric for a new dress when someone cleared their throat softly. Miss Andrews, the schoolmarm, stood nearby, her kind face creased with concern. In her hands, she held a slate and several pieces of chalk. "I thought," she glanced at Dale for permission, then smiled at Mariel. "I thought you might like these. For practicing your letters." Mariel's eyes widened. She looked up at Dale, who nodded. With reverent care, she accepted the gifts. "Thank you," she whispered. Miss Andrews squeezed her hand. "Keep learning, dear. Knowledge is stronger than fear." They finished their shopping under Mrs. Potter's wary gaze. As Dale paid, he noticed the telegraph office across the street was unusually busy. Men crowded around the window, talking in excited tones about land deeds and army surveys. He caught fragments that made his skin prickle, checking old treaty boundaries, reviewing all claims west of the river, government sending inspectors. Dale hurried Mariel back to the wagon, helping her up before loading their supplies. The ride home was quiet, both lost in thought as the horses picked their way up the mountain road. Evening found them in their usual places, Dale in his chair by the fire, Mariel cross-legged on the hearthrug. The new slate balanced on her knees as she carefully copied letters, the chalk scratching softly against the dark surface. "That's good," Dale said, watching her form each shape with determined concentration. Try making the R a bit rounder. At the top, outside, the Mustang's hooves thudded against the corral boards. He'd grown strong again, his coat gleaming with health. Some nights he ran the fence line as if testing his strength, ready to carry messages again if needed. Dale opened Sarah's Bible to the dog-eared page they'd been reading. The familiar words of Psalm 23 filled the cabin, mixing with the sound of chalk on slate and the popping of pine logs in the fire. "The Lord is my shepherd." Dale read slowly, letting Mariel follow along. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." "Green pastures," Mariel repeated, softly, writing the words. Her letters were wobbly but determined. "He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul." Dale's voice caught unexpectedly. The verse brought back Sarah's voice, her quiet strength. But now it also carried Mariel's trust, her courage, in the face of town prejudice. "You're doing well with your letters, daughter," he said, without thinking. Then froze, realizing what he'd said. Mariel's chalk stilled. She looked up at him, dark eyes wide with surprise and something more hope, perhaps. Or belonging. The word hung between them, unexpected, but somehow right. Like a key finding its lock, or a horse finding its way home in the dark. Dale cleared his throat gruffly, uncertain what to say next. But Mariel simply smiled, that rare, bright smile that transformed her whole face and bent back to her slate. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the Mustang quieted, settling into the evening peace. Dale returned to reading, his voice steadier. Now, carrying them both through ancient words of comfort as night drew its curtain over the Colorado peaks. Dale found the warning at sunrise. The paper fluttered from a fence post near the barn, its crude letters dark against the weathered wood. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore it free, reading the stark message, "Warning, Apache is out." The morning wind carried a bite of frost, whispering through the pines like whispered threats. Dale crumpled the paper in his fist, scanning the ridgeline for watching eyes. Nothing moved except snow dancing off the branches. Inside the cabin, Mariel stood at the window. Her face was drawn with worry as Dale entered, still clutching the crumpled warning. "What does it say?" she asked softly, though her eyes suggested. She already knew. Dale tossed the paper into the stove, watching it catch and curl into ash. "Nothing worth reading," he said, but his voice was tight. Mariel moved closer, her bare feet silent on the plank floor. "They want me to leave, don't they?" Her words carried the weight of too many forced departures. "Will they make us go?" she whispered, fingers twisting in her shawl. "Like the soldiers made mother go." Dale's chest ached at her fear. He knelt down, meeting her eyes level. "Listen here," he said firmly. "This is your home now. I gave my word to protect you, and I mean to keep it." But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at his gut like a coyote at old bones. The town's mood was turning dangerous. He'd seen it before, and Kavanaugh had influence, connections that reached beyond the valley. The day passed in tense watchfulness. Dale kept his rifle close as he did chores, starting at every snap of a twig or creak of leather. Mariel stayed near, helping with tasks but always glancing over her shoulder. Evening brought no peace. Dale finished the evening feeding. Boots crunched on frozen ground behind him. He turned to find Kavanaugh and two local ranchers, the Peterson brothers, blocking the barn door. "Evening, Stroud," Kavanaugh said, his smile sharp as a knife. "Thought we might have a friendly talk." "Nothing friendly about three men coming armed after dark," Dale replied, noting their holstered pistols. The older Peterson brother spat tobacco juice into the straw. "Ain't here for trouble, lest you make it." just business. That girl's claim, Kavanaugh said, stepping forward. It's causing a stir, making folks nervous. Best thing would be if you just forgot about it. Okay. Dale's hand stayed near his belt. The deed's legal under treaty law. Treaties, younger Peterson barked a laugh. With savages, ain't worth the paper they're written on. God's law stands above man's treaties, Dale said quietly. And it says to protect the fatherless. Show mercy to strangers. Kavanaugh's face hardened. Don't quote scripture at me, Stroud. This is about order, progress. Can't have Apache squatters holding up proper development. That girl has a name, Dale said. Mariel, and she's got more right to this land than not. Who? Kavanaugh cut in, voice rising. Then honest white folk. Then businessmen bringing civilization. You've changed, Stroud. Time was you understood how things work out here. Maybe I needed changing, Dale said. The words surprised him, but they rang true. The Peterson brothers shifted restlessly, hands hovering near their guns. Kavanaugh stepped closer, his breath frosting in the lantern light. Last chance, he growled. Renounce the girl's claim. Send her to the reservation where she belongs, or there'll be consequences. Dale straightened to his full height. I reckon there will be, he said softly. But not the kind you're thinking. The tension crackled like static before a storm. Dale could feel the moment balancing on a knife's edge when a voice rang out from the darkness. Evening, gentlemen. Reverend? James stepped into the lantern light, his collar gleaming white against his dark coat. His usual gentle manner carried an edge of steel. Mighty late for a social call, he observed, moving to stand beside Dale. Unless this is about that deed I've been hearing whispers about. Kavanaugh's face twisted. This doesn't concern you, Reverend. Oh, but it does. James replied mildly. Law and justice always concern a man of God, especially when they involve threatening good Christians after dark. The Peterson brothers shuffled uncomfortably. Even hardened men hesitated to show violence before a preacher. Perhaps, James continued, this matter would be better settled in court. I understand the circuit judge arrives next week. Perfect. Timing to file that deed properly, wouldn't you say, Dale? Dale nodded slowly, understanding the lifeline being offered. Reckon that would be fitting? Kavanaugh glared between them, calculation replacing anger in his eyes. Fine, he spat, finally. We'll let the law decide. But remember, Stroud, this valley has a long memory. He turned sharply, gesturing for the Petersons to follow. Their boots crunched away into the darkness, leaving Dale and the preacher alone, in the pool of lantern light. Thank you, Reverend, Dale said quietly, though I expect you've made some enemies tonight. James smiled sadly. Christ didn't promise us an easy path, brother, only a righteous one. He gripped Dale's shoulder. Bring the deed to court. Let's handle this properly before someone gets hurt. After the preacher left, Dale found Mariel huddled by the cabin window. She'd heard everything. Her small hands clutched the deed, its worn paper precious as gold. Are you afraid? She asked, studying his face. Dale considered lying, then thought better of it. Some, he admitted, but not of doing what's right. He knelt beside her, gently touching the paper she held. This is your mother's promise, your birthright. We'll see it honored proper, come what may. Mariel's eyes shone with unshed tears. The townsfolk hate me. They're scared of what they don't understand, Dale said. But understanding can grow like seeds in spring soil. He squeezed her shoulder. Tomorrow, we ride to the county seat. Time to make your claim official. She nodded, trust warring with fear in her expression. Outside, an owl called mournfully across the valley. The Mustang answered with a soft nicker from the barn, as if sensing the trials ahead. Dale added wood to the stove, watching Mariel carefully fold the deed and tuck it into her mother's Bible. Whatever came next, he knew they'd face it together. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a strange, peace-like Sarah's hand on his shoulder, guiding him true. Dawn painted the eastern sky in streaks of pale gold and lavender, but Dale found no beauty in it this morning. His movements were quick and precise. As he hitched the wagon, checking each strap twice, every creak of leather, every snort of the horses seemed amplified in the crisp morning air. Inside the cabin, Mariel sat at the table, her mother's Bible open before her. She'd barely touched her breakfast of cornmeal mush, and Dale couldn't blame her. His own stomach was tied in knots. "Time to go," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. Mariel nodded, closing the Bible with careful reverence. She wore her best-dressed one of Sarah's old ones that Dale had found in a trunk, altered with clumsy stitches to fit her small frame. The sight of it made his throat tight. Dale helped her into her coat, then wrapped a thick wool blanket around her shoulders. The deed lay on the table, worn and precious. He lifted it with the same care he might show a newborn lamb, tucking it securely in his inner coat pocket. Close to his heart, the wagon wheels crunched through patches of snow as they set out. Behind them, the Mustang followed on a lead rope, its breath steaming in the cold. The horse had healed well, though it still favored its right foreleg slightly. Dale had decided to bring it along. Somehow it seemed important that the animal that had carried Mariel's message should be present for what came next as they traveled. Mariel's questions came in soft bursts, like birdsong through morning mist. "What is a courthouse?" she asked, huddled close to Dale for warmth. Dale clicked. To the horses before answering, "It's where the law is kept," he explained. "Where judges listen to people's claims and try to sort out what's right." Mariel considered this, her dark eyes thoughtful. "Is it like when God judges?" she asked finally. "Mother said he knows all." Truth, the question caught Dale off guard. He'd been away from church too long to feel qualified answering questions about God's judgment, but something in her innocent faith touched him. "Something like that," he said softly. "Though men's justice ain't always as perfect as God's." They passed the morning in quiet conversation, Dale explaining what to expect. The judge in his black robes, the proper way to speak in court, how to show respect without showing fear. Mariel absorbed it all with solemn attention. The sun had climbed to its midday height when they crested the last ridge above town. Dale pulled the wagon to a halt, frowning at what he saw. The streets were unusually crowded for a weekday, with clusters of men gathered outside the saloon and general store. Even from here, he could feel the tension in the air. "Remember what I told you," he said to Mariel. "Stay close. Don't let anybody scare you. The law's on our side." She nodded, but her small hand crept into his, seeking reassurance. Dale squeezed it gently before picking up the reins again. As they drove down the main street, conversations died away. Hostile faces turned to watch their passage. Dale kept his eyes forward, his back straight, but his senses were alert to every movement, every muttered word. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered 30 men at least, with Kavanaugh at their center. The banker's face wore a smile that made Dale's skin crawl. "Well, well," Kavanaugh called out as Dale brought the wagon to a stop. "If it ain't our confused friend Stroud, come to make a fool of himself." Laughter rippled through the crowd, ugly and sharp. Dale ignored it, climbing down from the wagon. He reached up to help Mariel, lifting her carefully to the ground. She pressed close to his side, her face pale but determined. "Stand aside," Dale said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street. "We've got business with the judge." "Business?" someone shouted. "Ain't no business letting Indians steal honest men's land." More voices joined in, angry and mocking. Dale started forward, keeping Mariel close as they approached the courthouse steps. The crowd parted slightly, but the hostility in the air grew thicker with each step. They were halfway to the doors when Kavanaugh stepped directly into their path. "This has gone far enough, Stroud," he said. "All pretense of friendliness gone. You're making a mockery of everything we've built here." "Only mockery," Dale replied evenly, "is denying a legal claim because you don't like who holds it." Who holds it? He tried to step around Kavanaugh, but suddenly there were more men blocking the way. The circle around them tightened, faces twisted with hatred and fear. "Get the girl." Someone shouted, and the crowd surged forward. Dale pushed Mariel behind him, but hands were grabbing at them from all sides. He fought desperately, throwing punches that connected with anonymous faces. He heard Mariel cry out and tried to reach her, but there were too many bodies between them. Dale, her voice was thin with terror as rough hands dragged her away. "Mariel?" He struggled harder, taking a blow to the jaw that made his head ring. Through blurring vision, he saw her being pulled toward a waiting wagon, her small form thrashing against the men who held her. The deed slipped from his coat in the struggle. It fluttered to the ground, trampled under boots and spurred heels. Dale lunged for it, but someone's fist caught him in the stomach, driving the air from his lungs. The world dissolved into chaos. Above the shouting and the thud of fists, Dale heard Mariel screaming his name. He fought with desperate strength, but there were too many of them. Through gaps in the mob, he caught glimpses of her being lifted into the wagon, reaching toward him with terrified eyes. "No." The word tore from his throat as another blow sent him to his knees. Blood ran into his eyes, and when he could see again, the wagon was pulling away, carrying Mariel into the swirling dust of the street. The last thing he heard before darkness took him was Kavanaugh's voice, smooth with satisfaction. "Take him to the jail. We'll deal with him proper once the girl's gone." Then the mob closed in, and Dale knew no more. Rough hands dragged Dale across the street, his boots scraping against the hard-packed dirt. Blood trickled from his split lip, and his right eye was already swelling shut. The mob's anger had turned to cruel satisfaction now that they had subdued him. The jailhouse door creaked open, its hinges protesting as two men hauled Dale inside. The familiar smell of dust and old wood filled his nostrils, mixed with the sharp tang of iron bars. Sheriff Avery stood behind his desk, his weathered face carefully blank as he watched them throw Dale onto the cell's dirt floor. "That's enough," Avery said, but his voice carried no real authority. The men ignored him, landing a few more kicks to Dale's ribs before stepping back. Dale curled inward, protecting his vital organs like a wounded animal. Through the haze of pain, he heard the cell door clang shut, followed by the decisive click of a lock. Boot heels retreated across wooden floorboards. "You brought this on yourself, Stroud," one of the men spat. "I should have known better than to side with savages." When Dale finally managed to lift his head, only Sheriff Avery remained, studying him through the iron bars with uncomfortable eyes. Dale pulled himself to his knees, wincing at the fire in his ribs. "Where's Mariel?" His voice was hoarse, desperate. "What have they done with her?" Avery shifted his weight, adjusting his gun belt. "She's safe enough. They've got her locked in." The schoolhouse across the way. Miss Henderson's watching her. Dale grabbed the cell bars, ignoring how his bruised hands protested. "You know this ain't right, Sheriff. That deed is legal. It's got the territory seal and everything." "Maybe so," Avery said. "But you're swimming against the current here, Dale. Kavanaugh's got money, influence. He's already wired the territorial office about suspicious land claims and Apache troublemakers." The sheriff's mouth twisted. "Law favors money. Sad to say." "The law favors truth," Dale insisted. But even to his own ears, the words sounded hollow. Avery just shook his head and walked away, leaving Dale alone with his pain and worry. Through the small barred window, he could see the schoolhouse across the street. 2 armed men stood guard outside its door. The thought of Mariel trapped inside, scared and alone, made his chest ache worse than any beating. The afternoon crawled by in a haze of discomfort. Dale paced his cell when he could stand and rested against the wall when he couldn't. His prayers were wordless groans, more habit than faith. The sun was setting when he heard familiar footsteps approach. Reverend James appeared at the cell door, his kind face grave in the failing light. He glanced over his shoulder before speaking in a low voice. "They wouldn't let me see you earlier," the preacher said. "Had to wait until Kavanaugh's men were occupied at the saloon." Dale moved closer to the bars. "Reverend, please can you check on Mariel? Make sure she's all right." "I've already been to see her," James assured him. "She's scared, but holding up bravely. Miss Henderson's been kind to her, giving her a slate to write on and some bread for supper." Relief flooded through Dale, followed quickly by fresh worry. The deed, did they take it from her? A slight smile touched the preacher's lips. No. She had it hidden in her dress pocket when they grabbed her. Smart girl. Thank God for that. Much, at least. Dale sagged against the bars. "Don't lose hope, Dale," Reverend James said earnestly. "The Lord hasn't abandoned either of you. I've sent telegrams to friends in Denver who might help. And there are those in town who don't agree with what Kavanaugh's doing, even if they're afraid to speak up." Dale nodded, but despair still gnawed at him. "I failed her, Reverend. I promised to protect her, and now you stood up for what's right," James countered. "That's not failure. That's following God's call for justice." He paused, then added softly, "Your wife would be proud." The mention of Sarah hit Dale like a physical blow. He turned away, unable to meet the preacher's compassionate gaze. After a moment, James spoke again. "I need to go before anyone notices I'm here. Keep praying, Dale. The Lord hears every word." His footsteps faded, leaving Dale alone with memories of Sarah's faith, how she knelt by their bed each night, asking God's blessing on their home and land. How even in her final days, racked with fever, she'd whispered prayers for Dale's hardened heart to soften. Night settled over the town like a heavy blanket. The guards changed shifts outside the schoolhouse, their shadows long in the moonlight. Dale's body ached, but his soul ached more. Finally, driven by something deeper than conscious thought, he lowered himself to his knees on the dirty straw. "Lord," he whispered, his voice rough with disuse, "I ain't prayed proper since Sarah died. Been too angry, too stubborn." He swallowed hard. "But I'm praying now, not for myself, for Mariel. She's just a child, Lord. She's got such faith in you, even after everything she's lost. Please, please watch over her. Keep her safe." Tears he'd held back for years rolled down his cheeks as he continued praying, pouring out his fear and grief and hope to the God he'd tried so hard to ignore across the street. Mariel sat in the darkened schoolhouse, her back pressed against the rough wall. She could see the jailhouse through a crack between the boards, could make out the shadow of Dale's cell window. Her fingers traced the edges of the deed in her pocket, remembering her mother's words about protecting. It always, when she heard footsteps outside, she tensed. But then came the soft whistle of a hymn tune, Reverend James's signal. Moving quietly so the guards wouldn't hear, Mariel crept to the window. A narrow gap at the bottom let in the cool night air. The preacher's shadow fell across the opening. "Child," he whispered, "are you there?" "Yes," Mariel breathed back. Her fingers found the deed, carefully folded small. "Is Dale hurt bad?" "He's stronger than they know," James assured her. "He's praying for you right now." Mariel's heart lifted at those words. Quickly, she pushed the deed through the gap. "Mother said to keep it safe," she whispered. "Please." The preacher's hand caught the paper. I'll protect it with my life, he promised. Trust in the Lord, little one. He hasn't brought you this far to abandon you now. Mariel watched his shadow move away, then returned to her corner. The floorboards were hard beneath her, but she didn't mind. She'd slept on harder ground during the long journey that had brought her here. Closing her eyes, she began whispering the scriptures her mother had taught her, each word a comfort in. The darkness dawned his cell. Dale had just finished praying when he heard the soft toll of church bells marking the hour. The sound carried on the night air like hope itself, reminding him that even in the darkest times, God's presence remained. For the first time since the mob had separated them, Dale felt something other than despair. He stood carefully, moving to the window. The moon had risen fully now, casting silver light over the sleeping town. Somewhere in that schoolhouse across the way, Mariel was holding on to her faith. The least he could do was hold on to his Dot. Dale touched the iron bars, cool against his bruised fingers, and whispered one more prayer of thanks. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they weren't facing it alone anymore. Morning light filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. The room buzzed with whispers as townspeople crowded the benches, craning their necks to watch the drama unfold. Dale stood between two deputies, his wrists still bound, his face bruised but his spine straight. Judge Harrison settled into his chair with a creak of wood, adjusting his spectacles as he surveyed the tension-filled room. "This emergency hearing will come to order," he announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "We're here to address disputed land claims concerning the Stroud Ranch property." Kavanaugh rose from his seat, practically preening in his fine black coat. His boots clicked against the floor as he approached the judge's bench, a leather portfolio tucked under one arm. "Your Honor," he began, his voice oily with false courtesy, "I have here properly filed purchase agreements for that tract of land." He pulled out several documents with flourish. "As you can see, the Territory Office recorded my claim months ago. This unfortunate situation with Mr. Stroud harboring an Apache girl is merely a distraction from clear matters of law." Dale's jaw tightened, but he held his tongue. Across the room, Mariel sat beside Miss Henderson, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked even tinier in the vast courtroom, but her eyes never left Dale's face. Judge Harrison reached for the papers Kavanaugh presented, studying them with narrowed eyes. "These appear to be in order, though, if it please the court." Reverend James's clear voice cut through the proceedings as he stood. "I believe there's another document that bears directly on this matter." Kavanaugh's face darkened. "This is irregular, Your Honor." "The preacher has no standing. I'll hear him out," the judge interrupted, waving Kavanaugh to silence. "Approach, Reverend." James walked forward, his steps measured and calm. From his coat, he withdrew a folded paper, carefully smoothing it open. "This deed was entrusted to my care. It bears the territorial seal and the signature of Captain Thomas Wright of the 7th Cavalry, acting as witness under the terms of the Medicine Lodge Treaty." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Kavanaugh's face went from red to white. "That's impossible," he sputtered. "That land was never the deed clearly shows transfer of ownership to Sarah Whitewing." James continued steadily, who, as this document attests, was granted settlement rights under Article 12 of the treaty. Her daughter Mariel is her sole heir. The judge adjusted his spectacles again, studying the deed with intense focus. The room held its breath as his eyes moved across the page, lingering on the official seals and signatures. Dale caught Mariel's gaze across the room, mouthing silently, "Hold on." She gave him the smallest of nods, her faith steady even now. "Appears genuine," Judge Harrison said at last, looking up. "The treaty provisions are quite clear regarding land grants to peaceful settlers, regardless of their heritage. And Captain Wright's signature makes this binding under both territorial and federal law. "But, Your Honor," Kavanaugh exploded, his composure cracking. "You can't possibly entertain this claim from a child. My documents, your documents." The judge cut in sharply. "Warrant closer examination, Mr. Kavanaugh. Particularly, in light of certain irregularities I'm noting in the filing dates." He turned to Sheriff Avery, who had been hovering uncertainly near the door. "Sheriff, I want all land claim records from Mr. Kavanaugh's bank brought here for review. Every deed, every survey, every scrap of paper." Avery hesitated, glancing between the judge and the banker. The moments stretched taut as a wire. Then, slowly, the sheriff nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." Kavanaugh's protests rose to near shouts. "This is outrageous. I demand you'll demand nothing," Judge Harrison thundered, bringing his gavel down. "This hearing is recessed, pending full investigation of all claims. Mr. Stroud is to be released immediately." The gavel crashed down again. "And the girl remains under the protection of this court until matters are settled." "That's final." Dale closed his eyes briefly, offering silent thanks as one deputy began unlocking his shackles. Through the commotion of the dispersing crowd, he could hear Kavanaugh's continued protests, but they seemed distant and hollow now. All that mattered was the look of hope dawning on Mariel's face, and the knowledge that truth, God's truth, was finally coming to light. The tension in the room remained electric as the banker stormed out, slamming the heavy door behind him. But Dale hardly noticed. His prayers of the night before had been answered, even if the final judgment was yet to come. For now, that was enough. The sheriff's men returned within the hour, arms laden with ledgers and documents from Kavanaugh's bank. As they spread the papers across the judge's desk, the truth emerged like sunrise after a long night. "These signatures," Judge Harrison declared, holding two deeds side by side, "are clearly forged. The dates have been altered, and these survey marks don't match territorial records." Kavanaugh stood rigid, his face ashen as more evidence mounted. The sheriff laid out document after document, each revealing another layer of deception. Land sales dated before properties were even surveyed. Signatures from settlers who had long since passed on. Pages of carefully crafted lies, now crumbling. Under scrutiny, "The court finds Mr. Kavanaugh guilty of fraud," Judge Harrison pronounced, his voice heavy with authority. "He is stripped of all banking privileges pending trial. Sheriff, take him into custody," as deputies led the disgraced banker away. Dale felt the iron shackles fall from his wrists. He flexed his hands, looking up just as Mariel broke free from Miss Henderson's gentle hold. "Dale!" she cried out, running across the courtroom floor. Her feet barely seemed to touch the wooden boards as she flew into his arms. Dale caught her close, his heart full to bursting as he lifted her off her feet. The watching townsfolk shifted. Uncomfortably, shame writing itself across their faces. One by one, they filed out of the courthouse, heads bowed, no one meeting Dale's eyes. Their angry mob spirit had dissolved like morning mist, leaving only quiet regret behind. Reverend James approached them, his Bible tucked under one arm. "You showed real courage, Dale," he said softly. "Standing firm for what's right, no matter the cost. That's what the good Lord honors." Dale nodded, still holding Mariel close. "We won't be driven out," he promised her, his voice rough with emotion. "Not now, not ever." Outside, they found their wagon waiting. The Mustang stood tied behind it, tossing its proud head as if it knew justice had been done. Dale helped Mariel up onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. As they started down the road toward home, he freed the Mustang's lead rope. The wild horse kept pace beside them, matching the wagon's speed stride for stride, its mane flowing in the wind like a banner of victory. The afternoon sun painted the snow-covered hills in shades of gold and rose. Dale glanced at Mariel, seeing Peace settled over her features like a blessing. His heart felt lighter than it had in years. "Home, daughter," he whispered, the words feeling right and true. Home. Back at the ranch, Dale sat at his kitchen table, pen hovering over the adoption papers. Reverend James stood beside him, watching with quiet approval as Dale's signature flowed across the bottom of each page. "It makes it official," Dale said softly, looking up at Mariel, who perched on a nearby chair, her eyes bright with hope. "You're my daughter now, in the eyes of both God and the law." The Reverend added his own signature as witness, then pressed his seal to the documents. "I'll file these with the territorial court tomorrow," he said, carefully folding the papers. "Though I reckon anyone can see you two were meant to be family all along." Over the next few weeks, neighbors began appearing at the ranch gate. Some came with downcast eyes and mumbled apologies, others with stiff necks and wary glances. The Widow Peterson brought a freshly baked apple pie, while old Tom Jenkins offered to help mend fences come spring. Dale met them all with the same steady politeness, but his message never wavered. "Here's my daughter," he'd say, one hand resting protective on Mariel's shoulder. "Got the papers to prove it, though that ain't what makes it true." Together, they fell into the rhythm of ranch life. Dale taught Mariel to string wire along the fence posts, her small hands growing sure and confident with practice. She showed him how to listen for approaching storms in the way the prairie grass whispered. Wisdom passed down from her mother's people. The Mustang grew stronger each day, its coat gleaming as winter began to fade. One morning, Mariel stood at the corral gate, watching it prance. "We ought to let it run free," she said thoughtfully. "Like Mama's people say, a wild thing needs to choose its home." Dale nodded, understanding. They opened the gate together, and the horse trotted out, pausing to look back at them before galloping toward the horizon. But each evening, as the sun painted the snow-capped mountains pink and gold, it would return to graze in their pasture. As February yielded to March, the iron grip of winter began to loosen. Sunshine lay longer on the drifts, turning the crusty surface to diamond sparkles. New grass poked through in sheltered hollows, promising spring's return. That night, Dale tucked Mariel into bed, adjusting the patchwork quilt around her shoulders. The lamplight cast a warm glow as he knelt beside her bed, bowing his head. "Lord," he whispered, his rough hand finding hers, "thank you for this gift I never knew to ask for. Thank you for showing this old rancher that family's born in the heart, not just in blood. Amen." Spring swept across the Colorado range like a gentle breath, bringing with it new life and tender hope. Fresh grass pushed through melting snow, and the sound of newborn calves filled the sweet morning air. Neighbors, who had once turned cold shoulders, now stopped to lean on fence posts, sharing news and coffee. The Widow Peterson taught Mariel to bake biscuits, while old Tom Jenkins showed her how to mend leather tack. As evening settled, Dale and Mariel sat at their worn kitchen table, lamplight warming the pages of scripture between them. Her finger traced the verses as she read, her voice growing stronger with each word. Later, Dale led the Mustang to the pasture gate. He removed its halter, watching as it tossed its proud head and thundered across the open field, mane flying in the twilight. "Look there," Dale said softly, his hand finding Mariel's as they stood at the fence. "As long as this land breathes, so do we." Together, they bowed their heads in prayer, while golden light spilled from their cabin windows, a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk. Thanks for taking a moment to feel with me. If this story reminded you of what matters, hit subscribe. I'll be here tomorrow, continuing our story.